Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And today what I'm going to do is do my responsive design masterclass. So this means I'm going to be covering things like Flexbox, CSS grid, and media queries. So the idea here is just going to show you how to do a basic, like if you imagine top banner, then sidebar, main bar area type web design, and show you how you could make it and then turn it into a columnar design on a mobile phone. Okay, so bottom line, let's do that. Okay, so let's see here. Let's create an HTML file. So that's what I will do. Terminal, new terminal. We're gonna do it once with Flexbox and once with the grid. So I'll just say touch flex.html and grid.html. So that way we'll do a version with both. Let me let's open up the first one with live server. Okay, and let's move that over to the side for a moment. Okay, and let's just get all these pop-ups out of the way. Okay, let's get the boilerplate out of the way. I want to be doing the CSS in the HTML file, so I'm going to create a style tag to hold all my CSS. And generally the idea is this. We're going to have this particular setup. So we're going to have a header tag. Again, a header is just literally a glorified div. Okay, so we're going to have a header. Okay, and basically just to kind of imagine, basically, let's just do it like a draw.google.com. Okay, let's do this Google Draw. There we go. Let's just go create a new draw. And essentially the design I want to create today is going to be basically this type of a setup where there's basically like a top menu bar, and then basically you'll have like a main area and a sidebar. The sidebar could be on either side. And then when it's on a mobile phone, essentially what's going to happen, so let's pretend this is like a mobile phone. What's going to happen is you'll still have the title area. And then the main area, and then the sidebar disappears. So essentially that's going to be sort of like our design. Okay? So basically just to kind of imagine. And notice how like it's just squares. Like that's the way you generally want to think about your website. You just want to think about your as the page is a bunch of squares of containers that contain content in them. Like once you can imagine it just kind of like this kind of like layout, like okay, I can see the squares, it's going to be much easier to think about it. So I think about it like here I have two rows. This is the first row of the website. And this is generally how you want to think about it when you think about it in Flexbox. Because in Flexbox, really what's going to happen is that every row of the website is essentially one Flexbox container. Because we'll get into what Flexbox does in a second. So this would be like, and this would be row 2, and row 2 has 2 items in it. Okay, so row 1 has 1 item in it, row 2 has 2 items in it. So this is going to be my header, which is going to be where there's only 1 item inside of it, which will be our nav. We'll use the nav tag to represent the item inside the header tag. Okay. And then we're going to have we'll use our main tag to represent this row right here. Okay, which is going to have 2 things inside of it, which will have represented as 2 divs. Let me think about how I want to do that. Div, header, main. Yeah, that works. Yeah, we'll use like the main area, we'll use it as the article tag, which again is just a glorified div. Okay, these are just referred to as semantic tags. And then the sidebar will be represented by an aside tag, which again is just a glorified div. Okay, so essentially that's our layout. Okay, so think of the main tag as this bottom row. The article tag is this main area, the side is the sidebar, and then the header is this top row, and the nav is going to be the title inside of it. Okay, so that's essentially what our layout's going to be. I'm actually going to copy this over to grid for later, so that way that's just kind of all sketched out already. Okay, and now here, would I do this in CSS? So basically the idea is I'm going to think I have 2 rows. So I should have 2 things that represent those 2 rows. So that's going to be the header tag, because again, the header tag represents this row. And then the main tag represents this row. So those 2 should be Flexbox containers. Okay, but first let's just like let's just kind of give each thing a color, like a background color, and we'll put like a letter in it, just so that way you see some content in the nav. Okay, so this is just going to be like title, content, sidebar. Okay. So right now, do we see anything yet? Yeah, there we go. But see right now, now notice what happens. They all stack on top of each other. Because if I open up DevTools, even each of I say this is my design, okay, the natural way that HTML works is that everything is a block that just stacks on top of each other. So that first row, so basically we have this nav row, like if I would actually just highlight it from here. So if I highlight header, see it's just, that's a 1 row. And then if I highlight the main, that's another row. And inside of main, we have 2 more blocks that are just stacked on top of each other. So what Flexbox is going to do is that it changes that behavior. So we're going to say turn main into a Flexbox, which is going to say instead of things inside of it stacking on top of each other, they'll be stacked side by side. So we'll see that in a moment. But just to kind of make it easier to see, what I want to do is give each of these. So I want to give the, first let's give like the header and the main. They're both going to be now going forward a Flexbox. So what we do is we change what's called the display property, and I'm just going to accept that out of the way. We change the display property, and the display property is going to be called flex. That means now those 2 things are a Flexbox. So notice what just happened. See the stuff inside the main row, they are now being stacked side by side. Okay, so that's going to be like the main big difference we're going to see. Now, I want to give these a border so that way you can see like the row. So again, sometimes just putting borders around things can help during at least the design phase, can at least help you kind of see where one thing starts, one thing begins. And you can always take off the borders later. Okay, like a good example of what people will do is they'll actually create like use this selector, which just means everything, and then they'll just give everything a border or an outline actually. An outline, we'll say like 3 pixels, solid gold. Okay, and see now you can see everything. So you can see that like, hey, we have this first row, so you can see the big yellow square around it, and then you can see the title, the 1 item in that row, and then you can see the second row, you know, our main, and we can see that, hey, look, there's 2 things inside of that. You can see that because you can see the outlines. So oftentimes having like this outline, and again, you can later on when you're done, you can always just comment it out. Okay, and then life gets easier. But it's good to have that because it just makes it visually easier to kind of see what's going on. Okay. And let's put some margin between the head and the main so we can kind of see those containers a little bit easier. Margin, we'll just say 10 pixels. Well, 10 pixels auto, because I am going to make them a little bit, I'm going to make them like 80% wide. Just because, you know, a little bit less width. I mean, not taking up the full length, the width of the screen oftentimes just looks a little bit better. So you can see now this row is taking up 80%. And again, the actual row is centered because I used the auto. Okay, cool. So very good, very good, very good. Okay. Now, what happens is that let's say I want to like see how like all these items, they're kind of all flush to the left. Well, if I wanted to change that, what I could do, okay, is you would use a property called justify content. This only works on flex boxes. So justify content only applies to the flex container. So notice like I'm putting it on the header tag. So what I'm saying is like inside the header and the main tag, which are flex containers, the things that are inside of them should be, let's say, centered. Okay, and see like now they're centered. But there's a couple other options you can use. There is like space between, which puts equal space between the items. So you see now content and sidebar have been pushed to opposite ends because it's going to put all that space in between the 2. Now I could do space around, which also factors in the space around the items. Okay, So you see you have a lot of options with this justify content property. To really master that property, I highly recommend playing Flexbox Froggy. Just Google Flexbox Froggy and Flexbox Defense, and those games will really help you like master that justify content property. Okay, so in this case, what I want is space between is fine. Okay. Now that title, so let's say that tag was inside a nav tag, technically. Let's style that a little bit. So let's give it like a bigger font size. We'll just say 2 EMs. Okay. Text align center. Let's see if that will actually center it. And see, notice that like even though I did text align center, it doesn't center. Why? Because see, the block is just this. So it is centered, but it's centered in this tiny little block. Okay. And I want this, but this block is flush all the way to the left. So there's a couple different ways I can handle this. Like at the end of the day, this is the only item in this row. So I can just increase the width of this block. I can just say, you know what, the width of this block should take up the full width. So we'll say width 100%. And see now it's going to take up the whole row, and that centers the title there. Okay. So again, those yellow lines can be really helpful in kind of understanding like what's going on and helping you sort of like figure out the styling of your page. Okay, cool. So I mean that's like the title page. Let's just give it like a background color, like background color. We'll just give it something light so that we can tell what it is later. Burleywood. Okay. So there we go. So now we make it to the second row, and again, I already got these two things in the same row, so that's all fine and good. So again, the article has the content part, and we want to say, let's say that takes up about 70% width. Width is 70%. Okay, so you see now the end is all the way over here. Okay, so you see now it's taking up this much space. Okay, and then I can go over here with the aside tag, which is a sidebar, and say the width is 30%. Okay, and see now they fill up the space nicely. And maybe we want to give them a little bit of a gap, so let's just say like, maybe I'll make this 25%, just to give it a little bit of a gap. There we go. Maybe not too much of a gap. Let's make it 28. There we go. Cool. And technically, there you go. You know, you'd have like the content, and the content would then bring the content. That's where it would become bigger at that point. But I'm gonna just give it arbitrary height so we can see it visibly. Height, 500 pixels. Height, 500 pixels. Color green. Oops, I meant background color. And then background color red. Okay, and there we go. We have like the generic idea of our design right there. So you see like the title, kind of like we said over here. We have the title, the main area, whatnot. And again, it's just 2 rows. I'm just saying, okay, hey, we have the first row and the items inside that row, and then I have my second row, and then I have the items inside that row. And that's like generally when I'm using Flexbox, that's the way I'll design the website. I'll break down the design, so if someone sketches out a visual like mock-up, I'll break down the mock-up into rows, and then each row gets a Flexbox. I create the appropriate items in there, and then you're good. Okay. Now Flexbox has some other advantages. Okay, so this is fine when I'm doing a layout, but let's say you are generating a whole bunch of items in one row. So let's like create another row for the Flexbox just to demonstrate this. So we'll just say like we'll create a footer tag, which again is just a glorified div, because these are just semantic tags. Really, the only purpose of these is they tell the search engine a better idea of like what section of your page is, or like what content should be expected within that tag. So I know like the search engine knows like this is the footer content, the main content, the header content. Okay. But, okay. So let's say we have the footer. Let's make that a contain. And then we're going to have a, actually, well, first let's just style the footer. And I'll make the footer a flexbox. So I'll just kind of apply this over here. What we're going to do is we're going to have a class called box. Okay. And each box is going to be have a height of 200 pixels. Actually, we'll just make it 100 pixels. And a width of 100 pixels. And the background color will be black. Okay. So in this footer, so again, the footer is a flexbox because we called it a flexbox. And again, the cool thing about DevTools, if you look in your DevTools, it'll help you out. Okay, so if I go to the body, see, it tells you, hey, header is a flexbox, main's a flexbox. So then I can kind of like click on it and I can see, okay, that's the flexbox. So that means the things inside of it are flexbox items. Okay, and this kind of helps you kind of tell like how different containers are being treated. Okay, so let's put some containers inside of the footer. So we'll put a div with the class of box. Okay, with some text. Okay, and so we see a box. Now the cool thing about Flexbox, it doesn't matter how many things are in that row. It's just going to automatically just kind of add it. So you see like there, it's adding it there, and then it keeps respacing it based on the settings we have on that container. And watch what happens when it runs out of space. See, now it's going to start shrinking them. Okay, so whenever you have like this the space constraint issue, there are properties that you can set on the individual boxes. So I could actually put a class on those individual boxes, and I can use properties like flex shrink and flex grow that'll determine like, okay, hey, when they get bigger, which one gets more bigger faster, or when they shrink, which one shrinks more, because maybe there's a certain one you want to kind of keep at its normal height. Okay, so you can set, they don't have to shrink proportionally or grow proportionally. You can individually tweak that. You can even like rearrange the order of the items using properties on the individual items, so on the flex items. Okay, there's a lot of cool stuff, and there's also like a align self, which you put on the item to align the item itself if you want differently. There's a lot of really cool things you can do by targeting the specific Flexbox item. But again, for something to be treated as a Flexbox item, it has to be inside of a Flexbox container. Okay, so you always got to remember when we're using Flexbox and Grid, there is the container, and then there's the items in the container. Okay, like there's an empty box, and there's things inside the box that I can then organize in a certain way. But what if I don't want them to shrink? What if I want them to wrap around? What I can do is there's a property called flex wrap. That goes on the container. And then when I change this to wrap, so instead of shrinking and squeezing them in all on one row, it'll actually go on to the next row, and then it'll just keep generating them from there. So there's cool things you can do. And where that's really useful is for like storefronts. So if I were to head over to like Zappos.com, okay, you take a look at shoes, so you see like that's like a flex box. But let's say you go like we were to search for shoes, so we'll just say Oxfords. Okay, see how this like wraps. So probably this is just all one big flex box, and then when it's like one shoe, two shoe. But then if I expand the screen a little bit, see like the shoes go back up here because they use the available space. So they only wrap when necessary. Okay, so that's, just so you can see like Flexbox in action. So start thinking about, when do I use Flexbox? A really good use of Flexbox is when you don't know the number of things that are going to be in the container. Because Flexbox has the ability to like dynamically figure out, okay, this is how much space we should use, let's wrap it. Like Flexbox has that kind of flexibility, thus the term Flexbox. Grid's a little bit more rigid, but Grid gives you a little bit more fine-grained control when you do know how many containers are going to be in there. But before we do there, let's do the whole mobile responsive thing. Okay, so still here in the here. Now what happens is that right now, see, it follows this design. But when the screen gets too small, what I want to do is I want this sidebar to disappear, and I want it to have like a one column layout. Okay, so what I can do is in my style tag, what you do is it's called a media query. So I would say @media, and then you'll say at media screen, because basically we're targeting a screen. And then right here you can do parentheses, and then we can do something like min, let's see here. Basically we want to do it when the screen gets too small. So we'll say max width 300. We'll say 350 pixels. Okay. So what this means is that, hey, when we are on a screen, let's see here, still like complaining about the syntax. Media max width, I mean, that looks right to me, but let's just double check the syntax. Media query, always good as a developer to be willing to Google and double check things. So let's see here, add media only screen. Oh, okay, it's because it's and. I have to put an and here. That's the issue. Because this is one rule. I don't have to check for screen. So I'm saying whenever it's a screen and the max width of that screen is 350 pixels, then you can apply this rule. Okay, because you can apply all sorts of different rules. Like there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with media queries by saying, okay, hey, only if it's like let's see if I can find a good example. Any hover, like here we go, print. So like if it's used for like a printer, like you're trying to design like how it looks like when you see like the print preview. If you're trying to specify things for when like people are looking for like speech readers and how it reads out, there's a lot of kind of media queries you can use here to design how the website changes in certain situations. But here we're targeting specifically mobile phones. And then there's two approaches to this. So right now what I'm doing is a desktop first design. So you notice that all this is based on the design that I want to happen on a desktop. Okay, so by default, the default is the desktop version. And then I'm wrapping a media query for smaller screens. What's becoming more and more popular is actually the opposite, mobile first design, where you style it for the phone first, and then you use your media queries for larger screens. So you'll do like a minimum width, so like minimum width 350 pixels. So that way when it gets bigger than 350 pixels, you would apply the media query and you would say, okay, hey, here's how I want it to look like on a desktop. So that's becoming a more and more of a trend. Either ways, like you'll get to the same place. The difference is just like it'll affect the way you think about the problem. Like, okay, and the reason why it's nice to design mobile first is because generally most people use mobile phones, so design first for what most people will see. But anyways, so in this situation, what's going to happen is that like like any styles that I put in here will only apply when this rule is true. So in this case, I want to say, hey, like when the screen is too small, the aside, I really, to keep it simple, I just gonna really want to hide this. So I'll just say display none. I'm just gonna hide the sidebar. Okay, so now let's see what happens when I shrink the screen. Can I get it below than 350 here? I don't think I can do it that way. I have to do it this way. So to see this little button here that allows you to switch the browser into mobile mode. And what this allows you to do is to choose from like, you can either like do this where I can like drag and then shrink the screen and see. Now notice what happened. Like yes, the aside disappeared, but the content is still only taking up 70% of the width. So that still like kind of looks funny. So in that case, I need to also do this article, because that was the article tag, width is 100% in this situation. And then there we go. Okay, so now, and again, so now basically when we're in a mobile phone, you'll see it like that, and then when it's like in a bigger screen, it'll look like that. And a cool thing, it has like settings for actually specific phones. So I always like to do like an iPhone. I don't have the iPhone 5 anymore. That used to be like the smallest phone. But let's see here. Let's try the Pixel 5. And so you can kind of see how it'll look like on different phones. So see like, so in this case, like I don't want it to look in that phone, so I might change like the width parameters. So let's say 400. Because I don't really want it to, I want the mobile design on mobile phones. Okay, so that works. And an iPad, we can see the desktop design, that's fine. And you can kind of see how it's going to look like on different screens. So that's pretty useful. Okay, cool. So that's like essentially like the Flexbox methodology. Like again, the idea is just think of your website as rows. Each row is going to be is going to have its own container, and those containers have the display flex property. So again, the header contained one item, the nav. The main element, which is a flexbox, contained two elements. And again, our footer contained many different items. And then those items all got like laid out into a row. So if you think about your website in rows, and basically build out row by row, it becomes pretty easy to do it with Flexbox. Okay, now grid works a little bit differently. There's a couple different ways you can use grid. So I'm not going to get into every single way you can use grid. But bottom line, if I wanted to kind of do the same thing, and again, we'll just kind of put in some content here. So, title, and actually I need to open this one now. So let's open that. So let's open this up in live server. Article, content, and aside or sidebar. So in this case, I would want to do this a little bit differently. Okay, so the way I would do this is actually I don't need more than one container. So what I would do is I would actually get rid of the main tag, get rid of the header, and have all three of my items. Instead, we'll have them all inside of a div. And we'll have the div be called grid container. Okay, that's just going to be the class. Okay, I'm going to copy all of this inside of that. Because I don't have to think about it as rows anymore. I can just have all the different pieces. So the div is my container. And then I'm going to design how the things lay out in the container. I don't have to care about rows or anything like that. I can set it up any way I want. Okay, and again, right now they're all stacking on top of each other because I haven't told it to do otherwise. Okay, and so let me open up DevTools. Okay, so right now, if I go to here and I go div, see it's just a div and there's like three things inside of it and they're just stacked on top of each other. Okay, let me get out of mobile mode for a moment. Okay, so what I want to do is target that grid container class. So we'll call it grid container. And this is going to be the class that defines our container. So in this case, the display is not flex, it's going to be grid. So again, you always have either flex or grid, you're always starting out by passing that property to the container element, the thing that contains the other things. Okay, so now it's a grid. I can see like grid here. And you see like, hey, like there's like actually, like a grid is literally a grid. Like you're defining a grid of lines and you can put spots in those grids. Okay, the way I always think about this is I try to define like how many like rows and columns. So when I think about this, if I go back to my design here, if I were to kind of split this up, like this title, well, look how many of these do I see fits in the height of this, of the second row? So it looks like maybe, this is like 6 of these. Okay, so basically 6, 1, so that's gonna be seven repetitions. Okay, so I can think of like this times 7 is the height. Okay, and then this, and then for like the width, what I really want to focus on is like this, because this is like my shortest width block. So how many times does that repeat? So about 3 times. So it's like 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I really just generally want to think about like 3 columns and 7 rows. That's the way I'm going to kind of like plan out my grid. Okay. So then what you do is we say grid areas. Okay, grid template areas. There's also a way where you can specify the different rows and columns, but I prefer grid template areas. The reason being is that what I like about grid template areas is it allows you to basically define the whole grid visually. So what you do is, like I said, it's going to be 7, so 7 strings, 1 for each row, because again, 7 rows, which by default, they get split evenly. So that's why I'm thinking about it as like how many times does this column repeat and how many times does this row repeat. Okay, so again, essentially what I'm doing is, if I were to draw lines on the screen here, I'm just thinking about splitting the grid kind of like, let's get this screen up. Oh, imperfect lines. That's fine. Okay, we just won't. Okay. But again, 7, we want to create 7 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's our 7 rows. And then there's going to be 3 columns. Okay, so that top row should have 3 columns, but the title takes up the whole thing. So it's going to be title in the first column, title in the second column, title in the third column. Got it. And then for the remainder, what's going to happen is that generally the content takes up the first 2 columns, and then the sidebar takes up the third column. And then I can literally just copy this for the other rows because it's the same thing. And see, I'm just saying, hey, an area called content occupies this part of the grid, and a thing called sidebar occupies this area. If I was just imagine like a big square that I just chopped up into like even squares and rows. So I chopped it up into 7 rows and 3 columns, and I've allocated those columns and rows in that way. Okay, cool. So once I've done that, then the next thing is just really just me telling, I have to tell the CSS like which thing is this content area, which thing is this title area. So we just target those areas. So like nav, that's going to be the thing that gets, we have to assign it what's called a grid area. So we're telling it which area of the ones we just outlined it belongs into. So we're going to say, hey, you belong, this is the title. So this particular element belongs wherever that we mentioned title. Okay. And what I'm going to do is just so we can see that, we're going to give this a color, a background color. We'll say red. Okay, so you see like the red. Cool. And then the article tag is going to get the grid area of content. Okay, and then we want to give that a color so we can kind of see it in action. So background color blue. Okay, and then the article, the aside, we'll give it the grid area of sidebar. And again, these names are arbitrary. I could have called them whatever I wanted, as long as I use the names consistently. So if I use content up here, I have to name something content, but I could have called it anything. Grid area sidebar. And then we'll make this area background color green. Cool. Okay, so you see there, we got kind of the design. It's just right now like the actual grid is only so tall. So let's take that container and make it a little bit taller so you can kind of see it in action. So let's say 500 pixels height. And you can see like how it allocates the space. Okay, essentially there's like 7 rows, and this section got 6 of those rows, and this section got 1 of those rows. Like actually I can hover over the grid and you can actually see it in action. Okay, so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can actually see the grid lined out. Okay, and how does it know how many squares that grid is? That's what this was doing. This allowed me to like kind of outline each space means like, you know, each word is 1 column, and then each string is 1 row. So I sketch it out the way that I'd like. Okay, very nice. And this is going to make responsive design really easy, because now all I have to do, if I want to reallocate this, all I have to do is this. I say, hey, responsive, at media query, screen and minimum width, or actually max width, 400 pixels. Okay, I'm going to just say basically at that point we're going to target the grid container, and we're going to change up the grid template areas. So grid template areas, and instead going forward, when we're in this situation, we're going to have basically title at the top, and then the 7 rows will be content for 7 times, and then I can just exclude sidebar and say sidebar doesn't exist in this situation. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so let's go back to mobile mode, and we go get a mobile phone. Now the problem is like the sidebar still technically exists, so it just doesn't know where to put it because it doesn't fit in the grid template. So I get this like weird pushback. So I still going to want to make sure that I make that block disappear, so I can still just go do the aside and just say, okay, display none, so that way it disappears in the situation. And there you go. I have achieved like my mobile layout. Okay, because again, I'm saying, hey, whenever the screen gets too small, apply these, override certain styles with this. Okay, it'll still apply the ones above But if there's something down here that would overwrite it in that situation, it'll overwrite it. Okay, so that's kind of like how you achieve like responsive, like mobile responsive design, which is important because a lot of people use their mobile phones to look at websites. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you're like using your tools here, if I use this hover thing, I can actually hover over things, and you see this accessibility area. You double want to check like things like contrast, make sure that your font colors aren't too close to your background colors, because then you see you'll get this like little like warning sign saying, hey, people can't read that. Make sure that something shows up under role, because that's what like a screen reader will read. Okay, and things like that. You want to make sure like like if you have a picture that's clickable, that it has like an alt tag, so that way like it has some text associated with it, because the reader won't know how to read the picture, but it can read the alt property on an image tag. So things like that. That's accessibility, not really the scope of this video, but again, if you want a website that's going to have a maximum reach, it should be accessible, it should be responsive, and Flexbox and Grid are going to make it really easy to kind of achieve like your desired website layouts when you master them. So they're worth spending the time to master them. There are some fun games to really practice them. Like there's a web thing called Grid Garden for Grid, and CSS Diner to master like CSS selectors. I highly recommend playing these games. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this and have a better understanding of like the thought process of Grid and Flexbox, so that way you can apply them. There's a lot of properties and a lot of things you can do with these. So you could spend a long time just learning them more in depth. But the idea here is just kind of show you like how do you apply them, so that way you have that initial knowledge to go out there and like use them in your CSS. So have a great day and enjoy. I'll see y'all later.